Welcome to the second EMI seminar. Today we're talking about academic English structure and style. And there are actually several lectures that really relate to structure and style of English academic writing. Last time was a bit more general. Today we will talk particularly about one, argumentation, counter-argumentation, and two, the particular style and features of writing in your particular field. And then later on we'll talk really more about related issues, and I think the fourth or fifth one we'll talk, for example, about paraphrasing techniques, which really follows logically from today's topic, but that's kind of a big topic that goes later with one of the talks on, say, coherence and style later on. Today we're talking about, first of all, argumentation, because argumentation or rhetoric, as we discussed last time, is kind of core, fundamental to academic writing and academic speaking. In some way or another, in any field, you are making argumentative claims and you're trying to prove something argumentatively. Academic writing and academic speaking is rhetorical or argumentative. It's, of course, informative. You're informing your audience about your research, but at the same time, you're making some kind of arguments. In humanities, it's perhaps most clear that you are doing argumentation. You're trying to, say, argue for a particular interpretation or analysis. But even in science and engineering, you are, in a sense, making arguments. Even if it's just a write-up about an experiment you did, you are arguing, for example, that your experiment proves something, or that your experiment is interesting or worthwhile or cool, or your experiment deserves the funding that the government spent on you, or something like that. And so good argumentation is really important. What counts for good argumentation will vary according to your fields. So I'm going to have you introspect in a moment about your fields. In my case, I came from a varied background in theoretical and applied linguistics and cognitive psychology and education. And so I took a lot of graduate courses in areas that were kind of a interface between psychology and linguistics. And one particular class I took in psychology involved reading some famous articles in that area. And one of them was what was a famous linguistics article from the 1960s, and it caused a bit of a splash at the time. But it was rather a speculative article. It was the two authors' own theory and speculation about, how things are in this area. And the strange thing was, this article had no references at all. It was just the writer's own speculation and theory. Now, do you think that would be a good paper today? No, because no work is ever truly original. All work is based on or motivated by past research, or in part maybe a response to past research. Maybe in some way you're arguing for application of some previous ideas to some new area, extending something, or taking issue and arguing against some previous research or some previous results. But in doing so, you still have to draw on other research. There's no, you can't just make up something new out of the blue. And as we read this article and look back on it, it was famous at the time, but now we look back on it and really rip it, because from our modern standpoint, it was terrible. And the theory that they were proposing didn't last, because it had no basis in any kind of previous research, and it had no basis in data. It had no empirical basis, no real-world basis. And so it was, although it was famous then, today we would really laugh at it and say this was terrible research, even though they had big names, big famous names on it. Who cares? And that relates to another thing, authority. Last time I talked about the issue of authority. Asian writers will tend to view authority, give a lot more credence to authority. Like, this famous scholar says this, so we should believe him. Well, in the Western intellectual tradition, we would say, who cares who he is? I don't care. I care about whether it's right or wrong. Can you give me some hard facts or data? And this is an important cultural difference in academic writing in English. You cannot rely on authority so much. Sometimes you may rely on authority when it's appropriate, more so in humanities, sometimes in social sciences, But you can't just say, well, Chomsky says so, so I'm going to assume it's true. I mean, a lot of people like to argue with Chomsky. My background was in linguistics, and a lot of Asians will just believe whatever Chomsky says. And other people like me will say, I don't buy that. That's garbage. I don't buy that. Give me some hard scientific evidence to prove that. And his political writings are much better, I think. And then some of his linguistic writings have some ideas. Yeah, they have some validity. But some of his ideas, I think, don't, and I take issue with them. Give you a great example of authority, how sometimes authority is bad. How many of you like Aristotle? You remember Mr. Aristotle? The old dead Greek guy? Do you believe in his ideas? Well, when it came to philosophy, he and Socrates and Plato were pioneers in philosophy. And they had made very important contributions to the beginning of philosophy. But he tried to do kind of really primitive science. And when it came to science, he was totally wrong. And the sad thing was, for many centuries in the West, we believed in Aristotle because he was Aristotle. Because he was so brilliant, and that held us back a lot. Some of his ideas that lasted for many centuries were completely wrong about science. In terms of causality, he thought that there could be multiple causes for a single event. No scientist today would ever believe that unless you were drunk. That's just maybe in other philosophical fields, but not in science. He thought that the universe was a sphere and that it was finite, and he thought the Earth was the center of the universe. Well, that caused a lot of problems for a long time because people, without question, simply believed it. He believed that there were four elements, only four elements: earth, wind, air, fire. He believed that heavier objects fell faster. Why? He didn't do any experiments. It was speculative philosophy. He didn't do any experiments. He believed in what's called spontaneous generation. If you leave some food out, well, eventually flies appear, or before that, maggots. He thought that the maggots, the fly larvae, were just spontaneously generating. He didn't really understand about fly eggs and reproductive cycle. He didn't believe in what's called inertia. If an object will continue to move even after a force is no longer acting on it. He believed that objects won't move unless a force is still acting on it. Totally wrong, really bad physics. He didn't do any experiments. And so he had no evidence, and today we look at that and we laugh. Well, he didn't have any good arguments, but still people believed him. Today, of course, the criteria are much higher in academia. We'll talk about these traditions in a moment, but good argumentation, good evidence are really necessary in academia. Arguments that directly support or prove or help your point, what you're arguing for. So let me throw a question to you. Maybe you can discuss with a neighbor, especially somebody from a different field. In your field, in your area, what constitutes good argumentation? What kind of arguments, what kind of evidence are considered good and convincing in your field? Talk to a neighbor for a minute, preferably if the neighbor is from a completely different field. That will actually be pretty nice, the contrast. So talk, what counts for good arguments? What counts for good evidence in your field? Back together now. Let's hear from some of you, so maybe ask a few of you, identify your field, and then tell me what counts for good arguments and good evidence in your field. Any volunteers? Okay. Yes.
I'm not really sure, but I'm in the field of social sciences, and mainly the argumentation has to have a firstly strong sentence for the first, and then have a related evidence as a support.
Okay.
It's very basic things, but I think that's the main thing. Like connection between those two.
Okay. What particular area of social science are you in?
Politics.
Okay, political science. Okay. So what counts as good evidence? What counts as good evidence for your arguments? Yes, so what counts for what is considered good evidence? In a social science paper, what makes for good evidence to support your arguments, your claims?
First, you have to do good research through the journals mainly. Because nowadays journals have also new issues coming up.
Yes.
And searching through that one, and then have a critical thinking through.
So in a lot of social sciences, your arguments might involve claims about cause and effect, X causes Y, for example, right? Probably typical of your field. And so in the journal articles, what kind of evidence do the journal articles present you to support their claims?
Firstly, they do give us a ideology as a first step.
Like a theory?
Yeah, theory.
Okay.
And as it shows quantitative, that statistics.
Okay.
Also comes up.
So quantitative data. So a lot of social sciences are quantitative. Probably political science. Many areas of political science are quantitative. Do you know the difference between quantitative and qualitative? In case you don't know, quantitative would be statistical data, hard numerical data, and not just simple statistics like averages and counts. That's kind of like baby statistics. I'm talking about regression analysis, ANOVAs, factor analysis, principal components analysis, multi-dimensional scaling, those kinds of fancy statistical procedures, because your baby stats like simple averages or counts, how many X do this, that doesn't necessarily prove anything scientifically. In quantitative research, you need actual statistical procedures that compare things, and in order to prove something, to validate something. Okay, let's hear from someone else. How about, yes?
I am from information security.
Information security, okay.
Kind of engineering.
Okay.
In our area, whenever you claim a new idea, you have to, like if you are saying it's secure, you have to prove its security mathematically.
Okay. Okay.
Proof of security, we call it.
Okay, so it's mainly mathematical argumentation?
Yes.
Okay. So it's kind of quantitative. It's also a bit theoretical because math is more of a theoretical science. So in a sense, it's kind of a mixture of quantitative and theoretical argumentation. That's interesting. Okay. Okay, let's hear from someone else. How about back there?
My major is sociology. I think good argumentation is kind of, as you said first, we need a basis. So we respond to the previous research, results of research. So we need some basis of the argumentation, and also the kind of creative, just not based on, and we need more proof or develop the previous argumentations. We need a creative, and as they said, we need also the calculative evidence. So we have the structure of argumentation, cause and effect.
Okay. So the more scientifically influenced disciplines, like the quantitative social sciences, they're kind of influenced by the scientific method. They tend to be quantitative, the scientific method. And thus, the argumentation in science and many social sciences is kind of a very rigid kind of structure. The writing of academic journal, when you write up your research, it tends to be fairly structured. A lot of papers in quantitative fields tend to follow a pretty structured format. You come out directly with an argument, and you have maybe specific claims, each of which is supported by, say, quantitative data, or you have an experiment or several experiments which proves an hypothesis. So you come out first and state your research hypothesis, and then you provide an experiment or experiments that prove a research hypothesis. Now, anybody in a qualitative field? Do you all know what qualitative means?
Actually, I major in marketing.
Okay.
And we normally handle quantitative analysis, but I have read one qualitative article, which was like it have a lot of photos and voices of interviewees. So and a lot of archive documents as well. So the researchers they analyze the voices of interviewees and they analyze the taste of interviews like that.
Okay. And so the analysis may not be so rigidly scientific, in other words, it's not quantitative. The papers may not be so strictly structured. Quantitative papers tend to follow pretty strictly structured styles. There's often a particular style that you have to follow, a particular way you have to structure your papers, like introduction, literature review. Then you have particular details of the experiment, the experimental design, the subjects, the materials, then the statistical results, then the discussion of the results and what it means for your hypothesis. Qualitative papers tend to follow a looser structure. Sometimes there's maybe no particular set structure in your field if it's a qualitative paper. This is more, say, observational data. How many of you are in qualitative fields? Anybody in a qualitative field? What's your field?
International law.
International law. Okay, interesting. So, a bit qualitative. Usually would expect more qualitative people here. Oh. Education. So some education research is qualitative and some is quantitative. So you're doing qualitative education, and you too?
And also Korean as a second language.
Korean is the second language. Okay. So there is not necessarily a fixed structure for your papers. It depends really on the kind of thing you're writing about, rather than a particular style. And if you're in a qualitative field, there's often a certain format you have to follow. So what kind of data do you use in your research or in your field, in the articles that you read? What kind of data do people use?
First of all, we make up the relations with interviewees, such as students or others, teachers, and we sure that we will sometimes observation in a classroom or interview like their motivation. Yes. And we will analyze it.
Okay. So whereas the quantitative method is influenced by the scientific method. I don't know if you can you read this blue? This is not a very good marker. Scientific method. Let me switch colors. Qualitative research, a lot of it, for example, education research, is influenced by ethnographic research or ethnography, which comes from things like anthropology. So you're observing classrooms, you're doing interviews, and that's kind of like what an anthropologist does. Here, ethno means people, as in people groups or groups of people, not individuals, but groups of people, races and such. So an anthropologist would go and observe a group of people, a tribe, some people that maybe are cut off from the rest of the world. And basically, they are going to make observations, maybe do interviews, and try to make either informed guesses about why people do things the way they do in their culture based on their theory. So they begin often with a theory that's informing their interpretation. Or sometimes they might be trying to prove a hypothesis or a theory based on observational data. But basically this is observing people. So it's called ethnography, observing people. Observational data and other kinds of personal data. So probably smaller data, probably smaller groups of subjects, interviewing them, observing them. There could maybe surveys, questionnaires that are kind of more open-ended. You can do surveys and questionnaires that are not open-ended, that are quantitative too. So the research method is really going to affect the style of writing in the field. The style of the writing is going to probably be more flexible than in a quantitative field. The style and structure of papers is going to be more flexible depending on what you're writing about. So education, some areas of linguistics, many areas of history, for example, are going to fall in that category. So a lot of the humanities, some social sciences fall into qualitative. A lot of the sciences, many areas of social sciences fall into this category. Many social sciences use a mixture of qualitative and quantitative methods. And a lot of these can blend with theoretical, which is pure theoretical argumentation. Anybody in philosophy here? Philosophy would be a theoretical field, which is mainly theoretical argumentation. You're not doing research, you're not collecting data and such, you're not counting how many angels can dance on the head of a pin and things like that, hopefully. Or theoretical linguistics can be theories. You kind of sit in a chair. I used to do this, and I get tired of it. You sit in a chair, kind of pull sentences out of your head, okay, and you try to explain theoretically, oh, why is it possible to say this in your language, and why is it not possible to say that in your language? It's kind of theoretical, or sometimes it's armchair research, as we call it. These, in turn, come from different streams in the Western philosophical tradition. If you know empiricism, empirical philosophy, so any of you know Western philosophy? Okay. This was one brand of Western philosophy, people like Locke and Hume and Berkeley and such, who did not trust, their own senses. This is where the kind of scientific method comes from. It comes from the fact that you don't trust your own senses. You don't necessarily trust your own objectivity because researchers can be biased. And so there is a strict set of criteria that came out of this, like the scientific method, where you use experiments and you compare things, you compare different groups. And that's where the quantitative approach comes from. And this in turn is going to influence the way you write. If you are in this tradition, this is going to influence the way you write. The writing style is going to be very scientific. The style and structure of your writing assignments, the journal articles you write, or the dissertations you write is going to be very structured and tight and rigid. And you have to meet certain scientific criteria in order to really validate or prove something. And so the writing style is really influenced by the empirical philosophy of the Enlightenment and such. The other stream is rationalism. Maybe some of you remember René Descartes, who said, "I think, therefore I am," or "I think, therefore I am," if you like vegetables. This approach to philosophy is okay with subjectivity. They don't distrust individuals' intuitions, they actually rely on individuals' intuitions. In fact, when René Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," that's actually very profound, because basically what he's saying is, I can prove that I exist by my own rational arguments from within. I realize I am conscious, I think, that proves that I exist, and that's the starting point for this philosophy. You prove I exist, and then if I can prove I exist, I think, well, I hear and see things from the outside world, so I can prove that the world exists out there. It's not just my imagination. Which sounds kind of trivial, but in philosophy, it's really important to do that. How do you know you exist? How do you know the world exists? Well, from rationalism comes the pure theoretical aspects, like what we know as philosophy and logic, and a lot of math, theoretical linguistics. Qualitative traditions are kind of influenced by both of these. Qualitative traditions are really a mixture because you do rely on empirical evidence, but it's different from what the quantitative people do. The quantitative people have strict criteria of controlled comparisons, because in quantitative research you want to control for possible influences and factors. You want to have full control over causality. So this is about causality. For example, things like causality. What is causing the results? there are high standards here in the scientific paradigm for controlling for causality, because you want to prove what I did proved the result and not something else that was interfering. The assumptions here are looser because maybe what you're studying is kind of messier. It's kind of hard to put, maybe for what you want to do if you're studying classrooms, it's kind of hard to put them under a microscope and control everything in some kinds of classroom research. Where you're observing people in the field like an anthropologist, you can't control for what's going on. And so you have to rely on more subjective observations, your own theories, your own intuitions, your own insights, and such. And the theoretical is rationalism in its purest, which is just all rational logical argumentation, like the theoretical linguistics I used to do. So it's important to understand this because your fields and how you do research are influenced by one or more of these traditions. And it's important to know how and why you do the research you do, what is considered valid research in your field and what isn't, and then how do you write about it, because how you write about research in your field depends on the kind of research that you do and these assumptions. There are certain philosophical assumptions behind what you do and even behind the way that you write about your research in your field. And so this is where your argumentation styles come from. The way you argue things, the way you try to prove things in your research really is influenced by these intellectual traditions in some way or another. So any questions about this? This is kind of basic philosophy. Okay, I'm going to come back to this. Now, in the process of argumentation, in some level or another, you also have to do counter-argumentation, and it can be in several different levels. In the quantitative fields, if you're trained in quantitative research, you probably know about the null hypothesis. If you're trained in statistics, you know what this is. In other words, maybe I'm arguing for X, but my hypothesis is X. But there is theoretically the opposite idea that X is not true. That's my null hypothesis. And so probably your research in some ways kind of assumes this, even if you're not doing quantitative research. You're trying to argue for your idea. It could be your qualitative interpretation, a theoretical interpretation, or a quantitative hypothesis. But you're, in a sense, trying to convince the reader that X is true, that your interpretation is valid or good, or your research is cool somehow, and you're trying to disprove the opposite. You're kind of trying to disprove the null hypothesis. And it could be in several ways. It could simply, sometimes we actually state the null hypothesis in writing. In some kinds of research writing, you might actually state the null hypothesis. What is the opposite of your claim? In some fields, it's maybe a competing claim, a competing theory, a competing hypothesis. This is especially true in humanities and social sciences. In staking a position, you are in fact claiming that someone else's interpretation or theory is not true. And thus you have to argue against that, and you have to convince readers that your view is true, or that it's better. Maybe you can't prove it's true, maybe you can prove that it's, or show that it's better than the other. In science, there's an assumption that you can prove things to be true. In other fields, you don't have that assumption. Maybe it's an argument about what is better, or what is a better interpretation of facts. So there could be an explicit null hypothesis. There could be an explicit antithesis, an opposing viewpoint. And that's going to affect how you argue things. It could simply be potentially skeptical readers, where the null really is in the mind of readers who might be skeptical. So let's say you're doing an experiment and you're trying to prove that this hypothesis is true, or that this experiment is good, or this engineering application is good. Well, there could easily be doubters or skeptics out there, and you have to deal with doubters or skeptics. So in any field, any writer has to anticipate skepticism or objections to their argument. And you have to anticipate those possible objections, and then you have to have counter-arguments, or at least really strong evidence. And maybe in science it's more like you have to have really strong evidence to support your hypothesis or your research results. In other fields, it may be anticipating specific specific objections that the reader will likely have. So a good writer will be sensitive to the reader's possible objections. And so there are different strategies, for example, listed. I won't go through all of them, but basically it could range from, in some fields, it's maybe just finding a good counterexample, especially in theoretical fields. If theory says this isn't possible, well, you point to an example where, hey, this is possible, and that disproves this. Or it could be completely disproving a competing claim or competing hypothesis with your experiment or your observational data. It could be it could be saying, kind of conceding, okay, that may be true sometimes, or that might be true in some situations, but here, my hypothesis will work here. So sometimes it might be partially conceding that might be true, or that might be true in some cases, but here we need to use my hypothesis to explain this in this kind of situation. This is all going to affect the way you write and the way you phrase your arguments. And sometimes it's contrasting and comparing different viewpoints, different interpretations, different analyses, especially in humanities, like literature analysis, and showing my interpretation works better. So sometimes the argumentation is kind of deductive. So in a lot of fields, maybe your argumentation is deductive, linear argumentation. I have these arguments A, B, and C. A possible opponent might say, well, what about, and I'll shoot that down, and I'll present my next argument, and someone else might say that, but I'll shoot that argument down. So I'll kind of follow basically a linear argumentation. In some fields, it might be more of an optimization logic. So you have kind of deductive and inductive logic. In some fields or some research specializations, optimization. It may be a matter of, well, optimal. Okay, let's call it optimal. What is better? In some fields, you can't prove one is necessarily better than the other or necessarily true. What you can do is maybe show that my interpretation works better than others, or this hypothesis works better than others. And that's true in some social science fields and humanities. Again, there are different ways of kind of working in counter-arguments into your essay, and I'll have a separate handout on the seminar website about counter-argumentation. Depending on the field and what you're doing, you might actually frame your main argument as a direct attack. Maybe your whole paper is a direct attack on a competing argument. For example, you might say that, in the Asian writing tradition, you kind of paraphrase one side of the argument, and then half of your paper is spent kind of paraphrasing, summarizing one view, and then you summarize the other view. And then at the end, you kind of imply your thesis. Of course, that doesn't work. For one thing, simply telling the reader what the different viewpoints are, for many readers, would be intellectually insulting. In Western writing, the Western intellectual tradition, an intelligent reader in the field probably has some familiarity with different viewpoints. And so it's not necessary to summarize at length, but maybe if they're not entirely familiar with maybe an opposing viewpoint, you might briefly summarize it and then attack it. And so what you might do, for example, might be, those who advocate policy X falsely assume that blah, blah, blah. So you might kind of frame the opposing argument as a misconception. And this is in an extra handout on the website. So for example, advocates of such and such a policy falsely assume that blah, blah, blah. And these philosophies also operate on false assumptions. This is not in your main handout. So you might frame the opposing view at some point in your essay. The counter-argumentation, depending on the purpose of your essay, might be within a body paragraph. It might be the main idea of a body paragraph. For some essays, it might even be in the introduction. It might be part of your thesis. So it could be that the whole paper is framed as an attack on an opposing viewpoint and, more importantly, to advocate for your position. Or it could be that your main essay is positive in that you're presenting a positive statement that this is my hypothesis, but in the process, throughout the body of the paper, you have to at least once deal with possible objections or skepticism. So it could be done within the thesis, within the introduction, or it could be that certain body paragraphs start with this, or in the middle of body paragraphs. So the beginning of a body paragraph might present your positive argument, but then later in that paragraph or in the following paragraph, you then have to mention a possible objection, briefly paraphrase it or summarize it, and then argue against it, provide your attack or your evidence against it. And the reason I say briefly has to do with what we talked about last time, foregrounding and backgrounding. So when you present possible opposing arguments, it's better as a writer to background them. That is, you don't want to spend too much time discussing the opposing arguments. You want to briefly summarize them to background them. You put them in the background. And then you attack it, or you provide counter arguments. And a common way to do that might be with contrasting conjunctions like but, however, though, although. So for example, some claim blah, blah, blah. However, this is an incorrect assumption. Or although some claim that blah, 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 comma, then your main idea, the main clause of the sentence, which presents your main idea. So paraphrasing to background an opposing view, and then presenting your idea in the main clause of the sentence to foreground your information, your ideas, or in a separate sentence to foreground it, to put more attention on your claim. And so this is commonly used in academic writing. A sample which will be on the website, for example, has this. I kind of sketched out a possible beginning informal essay. For example, in this kind of sample essay, I'm going to, again, this is not in your main handout, don't worry. I might say that the Korean parents' obsession with English education is actually harmful and counterproductive, and I'll present a specific thesis like that. And I'll present maybe an argument. For example, I'll make one claim to support that, and I'll provide some statistics and evidence. And then I'll provide maybe another argument, and then some statistics and evidence. Again, this is not in your main handout. This is a second handout on the website. You can go get later. Don't worry. Then I'm going to phrase a possible objection. And so, for example, some might claim that this will enable students to succeed in college. And I'm going to paraphrase that and then background it. And then I'm going to say, however, and present my answer to that. And I'm going to say, for example, this focus leaves a kid poorly prepared for real demands in life, blah, blah, blah. I'll present some data and evidence. And I'll go on like that. And I'll present maybe in the next paragraph, paraphrase, summarize another possible objection from the people I'm attacking, and then provide my answer to that, and provide some data to support that. This sounds kind of mean, but the Western intellectual tradition is kind of based on attacking other people, trying to, it's not necessarily selfish, but that's how the intellectual tradition that is the basis of English academic writing has developed. It's from the sort of intellectual fight between differing ideas, which is how especially the sciences or knowledge progresses. Anyway, that's on the website. In the process, you're maybe going to be borrowing information from other sources, hopefully. So like that famous linguistics paper I mentioned from the 60s, if there's really no reference to either good ideas or evidence or data from other sources, or at least the past research, then of course your paper will be terribly weak. And beginning writers tend to make this mistake. They tend to summarize too much information when they cite other sources, when they talk about what other scholars or researchers have done. They fail to provide a very concise statement and work that into their own flow of thought. So what they'll do is this: they will summarize too much information, say about what somebody else has written or researched on this topic, and it will simply be a long summary. And one, it's too much information that's not related to their main point. And secondly, it's not really worked into the flow of their argumentation. And so, for example, if you hopefully outline your papers before you write them, think about if you're going to cite a source, other papers, how does that work into your line of thought, into your argumentation? Because inexperienced writers will simply dump a lot of information about what somebody else did, what somebody else wrote, what somebody else experimented on, and they won't really, so there's too information, then they don't know what to do with that information. I see this a lot with inexperienced writers. If they have this conclusion or this finding, how does that support your claim? Or how does that support, provide a rationale for what you're doing? So you're going to be referring to other sources, other researchers, other scholars, for one of several reasons. One is you're going to look to their data or ideas to provide arguments to support your ideas, your arguments. So you're going to be using it, one, to support. Number two, you're going to be citing them so that you can argue against them, because you're making a claim in your paper that is contradicting or partially contradicting what somebody else has done. And you need to make it clear. Do a short summary of what somebody else has written, and then make it clear, how does this relate to your flow of thought? Make it clear how this is supporting your idea, or make it clear how you think that conclusion was wrong and how your evidence provides a better explanation, or your hypothesis provides a better explanation. Or oftentimes, especially in the beginning of a paper, there might be a section called a literature review, or maybe in your introduction, maybe you're going to talk about the previous research, and from your discussion of the previous research, you're going to identify some problems. Maybe, well, they did this wrong, I think, and I think I can do this better. Or I disagree with that conclusion for these reasons, and I'm going to provide my own analysis. Or, well, they did this and this and this, but the past researchers haven't thought about this. And you're identifying a gap, something that needs to be addressed, something that hasn't been done. So you're going to say, in my paper, I'm going to look at this thing that hasn't been looked at before, because this is important, and you're going to explain why it's important. So you're going to cite sources for those reasons. And again, later on, we'll talk about paraphrasing techniques. So again, all of this relates to these assumptions, which are going to affect how you write your paper. Now, before we talk about writing specifically in your field, I do want to point out that there are these philosophical assumptions to your field, to your research. You all have a certain set of philosophical assumptions that come from the nature of your field. And along with that comes particular assumptions about epistemology. I'm giving some more philosophy here. Epistemology means, what is knowledge? What is truth? And this affects the way you write. The assumptions about epistemology in your field will affect the way that you write. In science, for example, there are certain assumptions of objective truth, that we are trying to prove something, or that we can prove certain things are true, or that we can get closer and closer to absolute truth about how the universe is or about the world is. And so in science, science writers tend to write with a certain sense of certainty when it's possible, when it's warranted, within the assumption that certain things are true. The theory of evolution is true, and it's proven, for example, and then what we're trying to do is work out the details. How did evolution happen? How did evolution occur? And I've read of certain debates going on right now within biology about the mechanisms of evolution. There are debates right now about the mechanisms. Traditional evolutionists believe in natural selection as the main mechanism. More newer biologists are proposing other mechanisms in addition, like group selection and lateral evolution, which is kind of interesting stuff. But behind all of that debate is the assumption that something is true, that there is a certain version of truth that is true, and other theories are not so good, that only one thing can be true, and anything that's different is not true. If some of you are in humanities, you probably may not have this kind of assumption. If you're in the humanities field, you may not care. If you do literature interpretation, literary theory, you probably don't care about concerns of ultimate final truth. What you're doing is you're just trying to find different ways of explaining why writers do what they do in literature and what influences them. And so it's a matter of finding interpretations that seem better than others, but there's not necessarily absolute truth. Maybe in some fields you're more interested in aesthetics, what is beautiful, than necessarily what is truth, especially in humanities. Sometimes concerns of aesthetics are really more important than what is true. There is also within your worldview certain assumptions that philosophers call cosmology, which is what exists in your world. What exists in your world. If you're a physicist, you live in a world of subatomic particles and forces, and you think of the world in a way that's very, very different from the way a humanities person thinks. For a humanities person, the world, again, consists of aesthetic concerns or concerns about history and how that influenced the way somebody wrote their poems in a certain way. And there are certain values. What is important? Values and goals. What is important to scholars in your field? Again, this really affects the writing. What is important to scholars in your field? What are the goals of the field? What kinds of questions are important? And I think it's good for you as grad students to think about it as a new grad student in your field. What is the goal of your field? Because that hopefully coincides with your life goals. Why have you chosen this field as a career? Probably coincides, hopefully, with your what interests you as a person in general. I chose, at an earlier stage in my life, linguistics, because I thought learning languages was really important, and I had certain goals and questions related to language. Later, my goals shifted to other concerns. I thought, in order to explain this thing called language, I wanted to understand, well, what is it in the real world that can explain language the way it is? I was looking for some real-world empirical foundations for understanding language and linguistic theory, which drove me towards psychology, because for me, the answers had to be scientific, and they had to come from the human mind, because that's where language comes from, for me. There are other people who make a different assumption that language comes from society and culture, and they will go in a more qualitative direction. It's a very different way of thinking from mine, because my way of thinking about language is more scientific to me. It has to be scientific. You have to give me hard evidence. You have to do experiments and prove something to me. Other people approach language from maybe a different set of assumptions. So these are assumptions that make your worldview. Your worldview as a scholar, whether you're doing music or English literature or education or physics or biology, you have a worldview, in your field. And maybe you're new to this worldview. You're still, as a new grad student, just learning what the worldview is like in your field. But it's important to start to realize what is the worldview in your field, because this fundamentally affects the way research is done, which in turn affects the way you write about your research when you have to write and do research. So, here on page 2, at the bottom of page 2, I've got a section called Writing Across Different Fields. And I kind of want to do this because I think this is really important. It's important to think about writing in your field, because I can't necessarily tell you how to write in education, and I'm not an expert on writing in all these fields. I can't tell somebody how to write in engineering and education and history and philosophy and architecture and everything. So I like to make you do the work. I like to make my students do the work. So as you think about these fields, there are kind of general approaches. There's the STEM, the science, technology, engineering, math. Related to that is medical and health sciences. Number 3, humanities. A few of you are humanities. Number 4, social sciences. And some of these could go either way. History could be a social science, or it could be a humanities field, depending on what kind of research you do. Linguistics also. So some of these kind of span between social sciences and humanities. Those in turn are influenced by these kinds of intellectual traditions and research traditions. So on page 3, I've got some questions for you to think about quickly. I'll give you a minute to discuss these. Again, with a partner like before. Hopefully, maybe you have an article, at least one article with you from your field. If you're a really diligent grad student, you probably carry around research articles to read, I hope. So hopefully you have some with you. If not, you can still think about these in a minute. And on your own later on, you can maybe go through these criteria, these items, and maybe do detailed analysis. Compare articles from maybe several different journals in your field and from related fields, and kind of learn how specifically writing is done, structure and style. But for now, think about the overall structure. Is there a pretty rigid structure to papers in your field? Or is it more flexible and loose kind of structure? Do writers of articles in your field, for example, use a lot of pronouns? When you refer to a noun once, after that, how do you keep referring to it? Do you use a lot of pronouns? In science writing, if you use a lot of pronouns, would it be very clear? Probably not. Science writing is very dense, so they tend not to use pronouns. In science writing, they tend to repeat the same nouns. Sometimes to avoid redundancy, you might use paraphrases or synonyms. And again, that will depend on your field. What about verb tenses? In papers in your field, do they use present tense, past tense, perfect tense? If so, if they use present or past, why? For example, in the literature review, do they use present or past tense? In the main paper, is it present tense, mixture of present and past, and why? Paragraph styles, okay, that's particularly verb tenses. Source use, how much of the paper is based on summarizing, paraphrasing, or referring to other sources? Is there a literature review section where you begin by looking at past research in the field and using that as a rationale for your paper, for your study, or as a basis for your paper or study? On the next page, how are sources cited? For example, within the text of the paper, is it like blah, 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 and then something like this, a name and a year? Or is it like blah, blah, and then a number in maybe brackets or parentheses? Because that actually is significant. And then at the end of the paper, when you have the references, the full bibliographic information, in what order do things appear? What's the first thing and the second thing? The because these systems differ according to field of study. Okay. For starters, in your field, okay, talk about this for a minute. Okay, so talk about some of these questions for a minute with a partner, and then we'll come back together. What are some of the major stylistic features of writing in your field? And then finally, the kinds of evidence or support. So, talk with a neighbor for a minute about some of these questions. Probably can't do a whole lot, but talk with a neighbor for a minute, and you can do more of this on your own at home. I'm following these kinds of criteria. Take a couple of papers, published papers from different journals in your field, and go through and look in detail at these different criteria. And understanding that will help you to be able to write, and maybe begin writing in your field in English by imitating the style that you see in academic papers. And these will tell you the kinds of things to look for. For example, in your field, are there certain kind of structures that are typical? Are papers structured usually in a certain way? And if so, then probably you will be expected to follow a similar kind of structure when you write papers in your field. If not, then what determines the structure? And maybe you want to look at if there's not a preset structure in terms of the sections of a paper or the headings and subheadings, then maybe in some fields it depends more on the headings and subheadings. In some fields it's maybe you're expected to have a literature review, then an experimental section and a discussion section. So you want to understand what are the expected standards and formats of papers in your field. You want to think about maybe what kinds of transitional words are common, which also relates to the kinds of paragraph styles. Are paragraphs more like theoretical analysis? Are they contrast comparison paragraphs? Are they kind of more narrative kinds of paragraphs, like in some humanities fields? Do papers tend to begin with one kind of paragraph and you have another kind in the middle and another kind at the end? Do you have descriptive paragraphs? Do you have more like example paragraphs where the paragraph describes examples of something? Because that's probably a key to how argumentation is done in your field and how you support arguments in your field with these different kinds of paragraphs. You probably want to think about how writers introduce new topics when they shift topics through paragraphs and through other kinds of topic markers, which we'll talk about in a future seminar. You want to think about verb tenses. So what kind of verb tenses are common in your papers? Of course, probably present tense, but how many of you read papers that regularly have past tense? Okay. Why do some papers use past tense?
Because in the research they did experiment.
Okay. So in a lot of this kind of tradition, when you talk about past experiments, it's more like somebody did this. And so it's framed in the past for that reason. But in some fields, the past research, especially more theoretical fields, sometimes maybe this too, when you talk about past research, you may still use the present tense. And why? Isn't that kind of weird, using the present tense? Well, maybe in these fields, the present tense is mainly for making general statements, like the sun rises at 5 a.m. And also in theoretical fields, theoretical knowledge, even though it's theoretical, it is a general statement. And so theoretical findings that people have found in the past may be discussed in the present tense because you're presenting this as general knowledge. And so if you agree with it, especially, then you might use present tense. So-and-so says and such. Maybe if you disagree with it, you may so-and-so claimed that, but I don't buy it. So pay attention to those tenses. Sometimes perfect tense. The perfect tense I know is hard for Koreans, but we'll talk about the perfect tense maybe later. But perfect tense, for example, is for talking about something that has happened recently, and recent is very relative. Recent could be a month ago or it could be 10 years ago. But it has some important relevance to the now. Such and such has found. When you say has found, well, you're saying it's directly relevant to the now. Maybe it's directly relevant to my research, to the rationale for my research. It's important for the present and implies something for the present. as well as the fact that it's more descriptive and vivid, it makes it sound more real. So the perfect tense, something that's maybe in the recent past or the past, but it has important relevance to the present somehow. We'll talk more about that later. So look at the tenses in your papers, look at paragraph styles, conjunctions, verb types, what kind of verbs are used, including modal verbs. There's a lot of can, could, would, should, especially here for some kinds of fields. The source use, how much of the papers in your field typically refer to other sources, and how and why. How much of the content comes from paraphrasing, summarizing other sources. That will vary according to the fields. Because in some fields, drawing upon other people's ideas and building upon them, very common in humanities, for example. That kind of source citation system. In social sciences, you see a lot of this. This is kind of, in humanities, like APA or MLA style. Kind of looks like this. Well, this is kind of APA, or that's MLA. But this kind of style where within the text of the paper you mention the name and the year. We do that in humanities and social sciences because maybe for us who did it is more important. But in science you don't care. So in science in engineering you tend to see this style. You don't care who wrote it. Who cares? It's irrelevant. Fact is fact. It doesn't matter if some famous or unknown person discovered it. Then you go to the reference section in the back and look at the order of things in the reference section. In the APA style in the social sciences, the full bibliographic info in the references tends to have the person's name and then the year, then the title, because that's how much we value things. Probably in science it's very different. Get to know the particular citation format. We'll talk maybe later about citation formats. You have to get to know the citation format in your field, whether it's APA or MLA, or maybe in science, it may be CBE or Vancouver, or maybe IEEE in engineering. Maybe other fields you have other citation styles. You got to get to know the citation system, how sources are cited, how much they're cited, how much they're used, and such, and how people use source information and such. And then finally, the kind of rhetorical support, which we kind of talked about already. So there are more specific kinds of rhetorical support. And it's good to look at these and see what kind of specific support is common in your field and why. Because that relates to your epistemology. What is knowledge, which relates to what kind of research do you do in the field. Your epistemological assumptions affect the kind of research you do. If you have, this kind of epistemology, you're going to do this. If you have this kind of epistemology, you're going to do some research that's based on this. So do this on your own as a way of learning to write. And then you can start to write by imitating the style if you know what things to look for, what things to kind of imitate and learn from as you start to do English academic writing in your field. Next week we'll start talking more about lecture and presentation methods, and then in future seminars we'll come back to writing. So some are more about writing, some are more about presentation, lecture, and conference presentation skills. All right, thank you, and hope to see you next week.